Ladies and gentlemen, let me say, first of all, it's an honour to be here. Ministers, I'm very grateful that you've found the time to attend an event of this sort. I'm delighted to see you here, and if I may say so, to my colleagues in the history department and indeed my academic historian colleagues in Belfast generally. I'm very happy to see and flattered to see so many of you here this evening. Now, I took the title Two Irelands in Conflict, and another title which I might have gone for was The Strange Death of Liberal Ireland. Two Irelands in Conflict, question mark, because I want to talk about the terms of that conflict. But the other idea I played around with and then abandoned was The Strange Death of Liberal Ireland. And why was I thinking like that? Well, as it happens, I'm doing a new introduction to George Dangerfield's famous book, The Strange Death of Liberal England, a lot of which is about Ireland, and which argues in broadest terms that this is the period in which English liberalism or the English liberal approach to politics is destroyed, not simply because of events in this island, but because of trade union militancy, suffragette militancy, and other tensions in the rest of the United Kingdom, but in large measure because of the way in which the normal rules of politics during the Home Rule crisis were challenged, and there was the great mobilization in particular of the Ulster Unionists, which many people considered to be at least in part illegal against the Home Rule Bill of 1912. And it's Dangerfield's argument that this is the period which sees the destruction of the characteristic liberal and consensual approach to politics, and certainly law-abiding and legal approach to politics characterise the history of Great Britain. Now, there are some problems with Dangerfield's argument, but it is a very, very brilliant book. It's very unfashionable with academic historians. Academic historians believe that in terms of the Liberal Party, the strange death, if you can call it that, because we still obviously have a Liberal Party, but the strange death of the Liberal Party, if one's going to talk about it, occurs considerably later than 1912, and they think it's to do with, for example, the First World War and the rise of the trade union movement and the Labour Party emerging as a much stronger force to challenge the Liberals off the back of that. And the conventional view among English historians is that it's a very vivid book, Strange Death of Liberal England, but somehow it's not quite the precise truth. And historians will argue, for example, that the role that the Irish question plays is very different from the role that Dangerfield suggests, because historians argue that once the Irish question was resolved in the sense that the majority of the island received independence in the early 1920s, that meant that Irish workers in England had no particular reason to remain within the fold of the Liberal Party, and this again was something which then pushed up the Labour Party's support as against the Liberal Party. So even as to the operation of the Irish question, historians tend to see things differently from George Dangerfield. But there's something I think that you have to bear in mind, which is that this book remains in print. Academic histories do not remain in print, and there's a reason for that. And many of the academic scholars, people like Ross McKibben, Henry Pilling, who criticised Dangerfield, their work does not remain in print for any length of time. And they write within a closed circle of people. Now, I happen to respect and believe in that sort of closed circle, if that's the right phrase, academic discourse of historians. I think it's very important. It's not to be treated with contempt, but nor is a wider educated readership. And a wider educated readership has kept Dangerfield in print again and again and again, and there will be a new edition next year. And there are reasons why that is so. He has brilliant, brilliant insights. Dangerfield, it is, who picks up on the significance of Winston Churchill's role during this period, who picks up on Churchill's visit to Belfast in February the 8th, 1912, just now 100 years ago and a bit. Very dramatic occasion in which his car is attacked and bounced up and down in Berry Street and Royal Avenue by shipyard workers when he's on his way to make a speech in favour of Home Rule at Celtic Park. And his wife subsequently has a miscarriage. It's really an important and significant moment. What Churchill actually says, and I'll be coming back to that at Celtic Park, is very important. But it's Dangerfield who gets all the drama in and around Churchill in a way, and the significance of that trip in a way that more conventional historians simply don't get. But there is one problem with Dangerfield. There's one missing item, or it's symbolized by one missing crucial item in his excellent bibliography. And that is a book I'm going to talk about a little bit now, W.F. Moneypenny's The Two Irish Nations, published in 1913. I think Moneypenny was dead for about a year. Moneypenny was a senior writer on the London Times from Tyrone, William Flavel Moneypenny. And his book, The Two Irish Nations, is a very brilliant book about this Home Rule crisis. And it's the one serious omission from Dangerfield's bibliography, and more importantly than that, the arguments in The Two Irish Nations are the one serious admission in Dangerfield's bibliography, because Dangerfield is the foundation stone of the classic liberal version of this crisis, which is that the rules were broken by the Tory right and the Ulster Unionists, and this breaking of the rules is responsible for the failure to get a decent settlement of the Irish question, which, if we had got, would have saved a lot of lives later on. And there is, I must say first, while I'm going to question some of that, there is some element of truth in that version. The rules were broken in significant ways by Ulster Unionists. I want to come back to that. But it is not the whole truth of these events. And if you want to look more closely at some other aspects which are important in this crisis, then you have to look at Moneypenny's The Two Irish Nations. Now, Moneypenny begins with what I think is an absolutely graphic sentence. Well, it comes after a review of Irish history from the point of view of Catholics and nationalists, and Irish history from the point of view of Protestants and Unionists. And then he sort of homes in on the crisis of 1912. He says, Irish history is a constant tragedy. And he defines what he means by that. A tragedy in the deeper sense, not as the clash of right and wrong, but as the clash of two rights. And that seems to me very, very important opening statement. It's not a tragedy because it's a clash between right and wrong, it's a clash between two rights. Moneypenny, all the time in his discussion of the two Irish nations, and you notice that he does consider, and I will come back to that, he does consider them both to be Irish. And when he discusses the clash between them, which is threatening civil war, I do say threatening civil war. I do not honestly believe there would have been a civil war even if the First World War had intervened. But I do accept that many serious people had such fears. In my view, it would not have happened. But threatening civil war in the view of many intelligent and reasonable people. And at the moment of this clash, he talks about it as not a clash between right and wrong, but it's a clash between two rights. And I think it's a very, very important comment indeed, and one that I find enormously attractive, and that's going to be the theme of the guiding theme for what I want to talk about today. Now, the first point that I want to make about the Unionist opposition to Home Rule is so obvious, I'm surprised it is not more often made. And it is this, that in the period since the Good Friday Agreement, we have all accepted on this island, and this includes all the nationalist parties, and includes, for example, Sinn Féin, the principle of consent with respect to the status of Northern Ireland. Now, if now it is the wisdom of all, including British Labour, British Liberals, and nobody was more enthusiastic in his endorsement of this principle than Tony Blair, if it is accepted on behalf of all that the principle of consent is the guiding theme for the politics of the North in the 21st century, why do we assume that those people who in effect upheld the principle of consent in 1912 are in some way behaving in a way which is outside the normal rules of politics? If the conventional wisdom has actually endorsed that particular position, then it surely raises some doubt about the view that we can write the history of the Home Rule crisis as being a history of a reactionary, right-wing, violent refusal to accept the normal rules of democratic politics by Ulster Unionists and right-wing Tories. And certainly Moneypenny would refuse to write it in those terms, because he saw it, as I say, of a clash of two nations from two rights. And it's such a simple, I'm just amazed how it has so little effect on the discourse. There is no market for writing in any way sympathetically about the opposition to Home Rule. Tory historians are overwhelmingly embarrassed by it. Lord Blake, John Ramsden, modern politicians, Chris Patten, they all take the view that this is a period when our party disgraced itself, when it flirted with illegality, and that is all to be said, and you know, worst case scenario shamelessly stopped the achievement of a benign compromise, which, if implemented, would have saved a great deal of life. And it seems to me that to hold this view and at the same time take the view that the principal consent should be the guiding theme of politics is actually incoherent. There's something, I think, which also has to be said about this. There is a problem in political theory. The British Constitution is not written down, but there is a real problem. And the simplest metaphor that you can use, was used often enough at the time, is that if you're on a ship, you obey the captain. But if the captain says, well, actually, as recently happened with an Italian captain, I'm not really too concerned about your fate, and I have other priorities, then you can really, it's up to you to defend yourself and your own interests as best you can. And this is the problem with the discussion of the Unionist opposition to Home Rule, because in principle, not in fact in practice, but at some level, the Liberal government in London is saying, we intend unilaterally to modify dramatically the terms of your membership of the United Kingdom. And there is a real problem about doing this and saying this to a large and coherent community in the North East. There is a real problem about attempting to do it. If you stop and think what the attitude, just transfer it to a different argument, which is used at the time. Suppose one said, we're a bit tired of the Channel Islands, let's transfer the sovereignty to France. Again, there are real issues about what the obligations are of the people who find themselves in that situation. And they certainly are not the same obligations as apply to people who do not find themselves in that situation. So it's a very, very important aspect of this debate, which just requires some stressing. Now, you have to then, of course, realize other aspects of reality which come into play at this point. But fundamentally, it's important to grasp the nature of the position that the Unionist community finds itself in. Now, there's a very strong argument against the point that I've just made, and it is as follows. It is that actually we are talking simply about Home Rule here, not independence for Ireland, and that, in fact, John Redmond, as I argue very strongly in my book, Ideology and the Irish Question, had a plausible and moderate political strategy, and was devoted to the principle of reconciliation between the two traditions, and that in consequence, for Unionists to behave in this way when not threatened by a separatist Irish Republic, but were challenged by a moderate constitutional nationalism, and by, above all, a project of Home Rule, not separatism, is not actually, it's not the same thing, and it isn't, and it's a perfectly fair point. And in general, I think one of the things that has to be said bluntly about the Unionist leadership is that in later years, many of them, I'm thinking of Wilfred Spender, Craig Avon himself, and so on, you can find them saying that actually Redmond was a decent man, a man that we could have worked with, that there were things that could have been done. Carson at the time, of course, was personally close to Redmond. But most of them in later years, you could find them saying this. At the time, most of their comments on Redmond are bitter and unjust. And it just has to be said. And rereading and preparing for this lecture, I was struck how bitter and unjust the Unionist discourse was about the degree to which it is bitter and unjust about the nationalist leadership in this period. But on the more substantive point, the fact that it is Home Rule and not separatism does not change the situation. We actually now know from the case of Scotland that those people who tell you, go for home rule, everybody knows that's going to stop nationalism and separatism. Of course it is. You're a fool if you don't understand that that's going to end this problem and we'll all have a benign compromise forever afterwards. We actually now know this system is not true. We are in a different situation, and the question of Scotland's membership of the United Kingdom is a very real and very live one. Now, without any disrespect to Scottish nationalism, it doesn't have anything like the emotional and historical strength of Irish nationalism. I mean, there are people in Scotland today who remember the poll tax, who remember closure of Ravenscroft, other things which I fully understand caused great anger against Thatcherite England. There were people in Ireland still alive who remembered the famine during the War of Independence. It's a bit different. It really is a bit different. The emotions which were profound historical reasons which fuel Irish nationalism are so much stronger than Scottish nationalism. But even so, even in the case of Scotland, we have seen that devolution does not just switch off the question of separatism. That's the first thing. And the second thing is the case of Scotland shows, and this is what the Unionists said, the enormous difficulty, once you have established a parliament in Dublin, even if it has limited powers, it is impossible to start clawing back from Westminster. It goes only one way. And the case of Scotland today confirms the logic of that argument. So it may, you know, so it does not end the discussion simply to say this was an unreal, an exaggerated campaign because a home rule was at the issue, not this independent republic. I'm afraid we now know it doesn't end that discussion. It is entirely fair to say that much of the Unionist discourse was bitter, inflamed, and sectarian. And that is an entirely fair observation, and I wouldn't in any way want to challenge that. So what I've been trying to say tonight is that when we look at this period, I do think it is right to look at these matters in the spirit that's suggested by Moneypenny. And Moneypenny, like Dangerfield, was also very struck by Churchill's visit to Belfast and the speech that Churchill made. And he noticed the way in which Churchill actually couches his the way he couches his language as an appeal to Protestants to somehow find it in their hearts to accept a difficult outcome in terms of a home rule settlement, and a constant theme of reassurance, for example, that Ireland is now so economically dependent on London in terms of London paying for the old age pensions and so on, that this is going to be an independence which in an economic sense is going to be very weak, and therefore means that a great deal of control will still remain in London. And that's the way in which Churchill makes that argument. And there is a desperate straining in Churchill's speech, and it's all the time accepting that there is actually a very fundamental cleavage here. And it's also the case, of course, that while Churchill was prepared to come to Celtic Park and to campaign in favour of home rule, and while he was prepared to consider military activity, military actions against Ulster Unionists, the opposition to home rule later on when he thought it was getting out of control and unwilling to compromise, Churchill fundamentally does believe in what we now today call the principle of consent, and does believe that something like a partitionist settlement is going to have to emerge. At the time, his problem was that he felt that many of the Unionists were not willing to accept even that as a sensible compromise. Now, I want to conclude by looking a little bit more optimistically at something that Moneypenny actually says, which is he talks about the conflict between the two nations. He writes his own version of the Catholic nationalist history and the Protestant Unionist history up to 1912. He says this is a clash not between right and wrong, between two great rights. And he does that very, very carefully. And he says we're getting the beginnings in Ireland of a new history. of historians who are trying to transcend the prejudices of their own particular tribe. And he says this over time, he says, we're just seeing the beginnings of it, this over time can play a role. And then towards the end of the book, he can play a role in bringing together these two communities, because all the time, what he's saying is that you have to recognize there are two Irish nations. You have to recognize the depth of the cleavage. You have to have political settlements and compromises, which reflects that. But we must work towards a better day. And this is going to take time. There's no political shortcut. He keeps saying that. There's no political shortcut here available. But 100 years later, we're entitled to talk a bit about long-term developments. And this is a passage on page 65 of the book, which I hope to end on as offering a little bit of hope. What he says is this: I have shown how deep is the feud between the two Irish nations, how it has contrived to draw its bitterness from all the various animosities of race and class and religion, and maintains itself on the memories of centuries of struggle. We may regret that there is such a cleavage in Irish society. We may look forward to the day when it will have ceased to exist, but it is present as much a fact of the situation as the Irish Sea itself. Mr. Churchill, in his speech which he delivered in Belfast, was compelled almost against his will to give it recognition. He devoted the greater part of the speech to what he called the Irish argument, and the time so spent was divided between an enumeration of the fetters that are to be placed on one of the Irish nations to save the other from oppression. In other words, the guarantees that reducing the power of the Catholic nationalist community and saying to unionists, you can put up with this because we're going to actually reduce their power in various ways. And an appeal to the other, the Protestant unionist community, varying from entreaty to expostulations to sink its own identity. And Moneypenny said this is not the way forward. This cannot work. But he says, over time, these communities are both Irish, and he keeps insisting on this, and he keeps insisting on their common roots in this country. Over time, these two communities can work together. Over time, a better and more scholarly history can underpin that effort. And I think those remarks of Moneypenny's are particularly appropriate at this moment when we enter into this era of commemorations. I think there will be a particular duty on historians over the next decade to try and talk about these events in a way which is as objective and as serious and as fair as possible. It is not always easy. I have been struck, preparing again for this lecture, something which I had actually to a degree forgotten, which is the degree to which the language of intimidation plays such a major role in unionist discourse in this period. And I have been struck by the way in which it would be entirely fair for any historian to draw attention to some speeches which are actually outrageous and sectarian and threatening, given by prominent unionist leaders in this period. I have also been struck by the degree to which there are those on the nationalist side who seem to be deliberately determined to justify every fear that the unionist community might have about the future in the speeches that are made in this period of time. I'm also struck by the way in which people talk past each other in this period, consistently. So whenever unionists talk about the economic problems associated with Home Rule, nationalists say, you're not really interested in the economic problems associated with Home Rule, you're just interested in a creed of sectarian bigotry. Now the truth is, while many unionists were sectarian, it is also true that many of them were absolutely focused on the economic problems that are created by Home Rule and the dangers and the purely economic dangers that would be that could well have accompanied Home Rule at that period of time. So it might be said that this is a series of bad lessons, but I'm hoping now that we can learn from all these bad lessons so we can move into the space that Moneypenny talks about, where without trying to force things, calmly and underpinned by better historical work, the relations between the two nations in this island become closer and more intimate. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.